sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 8, Inappropriate Behavior.
Would you get a load of this place?
Lucas couldn't fight back the grin that spread across his face as he stepped inside behind the others. The austere and gothic design of the outside bled through the walls, bringing with it the same drab and gloomy gray, but in a way that spoke of nostalgia, memories of days long gone when this place was in its prime. Now, time-worn and sun-faded, the clever vaulted arches on each floor and glittering marble pillars felt out of place. It was exactly the kind of gaudy, retro vibe that he loved.
I do not have time for this.
Undine spun on the Arcanist.
I've seen your magic. Together, we could fight our way out of here.
Rolling his one eye, Atlas stepped around the warrior dryad and let out a dry chuckle.
Ain't gonna happen. If I thought we could strong-arm our way out of this, I would have already. Just relax. I have a much more subtle approach in mind.
He led them through the maze of red velvet ropes, pulling to a stop in front of the reception desk. The sea and the neon lights that hung above it had gone out. At the end of their queue line was a sign that displayed a message in glittering gold ink. The letters shifted around from some language he couldn't read to one he could.
Welcome to the Grand Echo Resort and Spa. If you are here seeking your worships, please head up to floor 7. If you are checking in, please speak with reception.
Lucas stood on the balls of his feet, craning his neck to see what else was outside the lobby. It opened up into the massive atrium, and he could see the masterpiece of the resort, a titanic crystal chandelier. At least 20 feet wide, extending down dozens of floors, it gently diffused the light flooding in through the countless windows, breaking up the bleak surroundings with little pops of color. Beneath the chandelier was an indoor pool. No, more like a lake that stretched on and on, disappearing beyond Lucas's sight. The water was empty, devoid of laughing children or couples splashing and playing games. Perhaps it was because the water was ocean black instead of the usual crystal blue.
This doesn't look like any hotel I've ever seen.
He jumped out of the way as a tall, incredibly hairy bellhop plowed past him with a cart full of luggage, closely followed by a giant woman whose skin sparkled like frost. Lucas chuckled as the term Bigfoot came to mind. He pulled out his disposable camera and snapped a picture, but he was sure it would come out blurry, like they all did. He watched another group of guests skirting around the hodgepodge collection of chairs and couches, talking animatedly with one another. This group was, simply put, beautiful, Herculean. Their muscles had muscles, even the women. One man, who could model a trash bag and make it look like high fashion, caught Lucas staring and flashed him a white smile before winking at him. Lucas blushed as he turned away with a silly grin.
Is this heaven?
Yes.
Atlas pulled a face.
Kind of. No, I guess not.
He ran his fingers through his hair and licked his lips before he approached the reception desk. There was a pretty-faced man sitting in the chair behind it, answering calls, signing forms, checking in other guests, and responding to emails with dizzying efficiency. It could have been from years of experience, but it was probably those 6 arms of his.
Welcome to the Grand Echo Resort and Spa. What is the nature of your stay?
Atlas leaned against the counter, pulling out his best smile and cranked up the charm.
Hello. Yes, hi there.
He paused, reaching out to touch the man's chest as he read the name printed on the badge there.
Sirius. I like that name.
He winked. 2 of the man's arms dropped the clipboards they had been holding, and Sirius dove awkwardly to pick them up, returning quickly with a small titter and flushed cheeks. Atlas's smile widened as he tilted his head to one side, leaning in to whisper,
"I'd love to meet up later and learn your last name. But first, my friends and I are fresh from the courthouse and looking to correct a mistake."
He pulled out a copy of their contract with a flourish.
"This here says we're supposed to serve 8 years apiece, and that's, to put it mildly, a grievous clerical error."
He licked his lips.
"The judge told us it would only be 8 hours.
He fluttered his lashes and thickened his voice.
"I'd be extremely appreciative if you could help me out."
With a nervous chuckle, Sirius looked around. Sure he wasn't in danger of being overheard, he leaned in.
"I'd love to help you. I really would."
He absently began filing papers again with 2 of his 6 hands.
"But this is outside my purview. You'll have to take it up with the hotel manager."
The way Sirius emphasized those last words, Atlas could swear he saw flashes of lightning and heard foreboding claps of thunder. Atlas slowly pulled the paper back off the desk. He stared at the man for a full minute, his lower lip pouting ever so slightly. But those 6 arms and pretty face gave nothing away. He let out a huff through his nose.
"Fine. Where can I find him?" "Her office is down the hall, 3rd door on your left, 2nd room down. Mind the gap."
Sirius had repeated the sentence so often it barely broke his concentration as he handed a room key to another customer and signed a fax with his free hands while doing so.
"And should Sir find his room lacking in anything, I'm off work at 8.
Giving the man another wink, Atlas returned to the others.
"It took some doing, but I broke him down and managed to get us an appointment with the manager."
He scratched his head, ignoring the incredulous looks from the others.
"But don't worry, my charm should work on this woman, and we'll be out of here in a day or 2.
He didn't wait for any arguments or grumbles before he began ambling off toward a darkened hallway. Lucas snapped a few more photos of interesting things they passed as they walked. There was an absolutely terrible velvet couch in a faded puce color, a mirror that displayed a couple deep in conversation. He was wearing a bright orange kilt and a wooden mask, and her features were hidden behind long locks of sopping black hair, but they weren't there when he glanced back again. There were living wisps of fire that came out of the sconces, large black dogs that dissolved into the shadows, and a school of ghostly fish that glided along the air above them. After jumping over what could hardly be called a gap, it was more of a gaping maw of black in a massive fissure, they came to a stop before a large oak door. The word manager was spelled out in flaking gold letters across its surface. Atlas turned to the Dryad, slapping at his hand as another bright flash from his yellow box nearly blinded him.
"Stop that! You're embarrassing me."
He looked back to the door, his knuckles hovering over the plaque.
"I'd put that away if I were you. Most of the gods around here don't generally like photos taken of them."
"Yeah, okay. Wait, gods?"
"I'll explain later."
Atlas lowered his voice, leaning towards the others.
"Let me do the work here. I'm pulling out all the stops this time. I'll look her deep in the eyes, tell her she has hair like a golden sunset, and we'll be out of here before you can find something else to take a picture of."
He let his knuckles fall against the door several times. The door, responding to the knock, opened with a slow, eerie creak. They stepped inside the room and waited for their eyes to adjust. Several candles flickered to life, green flames bursting into existence before more points of ghostly light followed. They hung from the ceiling or sat in pools of dried wax on the many bookcases that lined almost the entirety of the 4 walls. Every shelf was laden with dozens of stone sculptures, each one just a head or a bust, their features pulled into sharp, horrifying relief in the dancing firelight. Behind the wooden desk, which was nearly buckling under the weight of stacks of paperwork, was a high-back chair. When Atlas had managed to gather his courage, he cleared his throat, and it spun around to face them. Sitting in it, cross-legged and bored, was the hotel manager. Atlas swallowed hard as his mouth began to water, yet inexplicably felt dry as cracked leather. She had the kind of curves you could race around all night, and a business suit that accentuated each and every one. Her face, however, was partially hidden behind a thick veil, decorated with a stylized eye. But her plump, luscious lips were smiling up at him. Her braided black hair was broken up by thick bands of white that— wait, that wasn't hair. He saw a snake coil up the woman's shoulder and stretch its tired muscles with a big yawn, its jaw dislocating for a moment before it worked it back into place and closed its mouth. As the snake moved back in line with the others, Atlas realized what a rare sight this was. He licked his lips again, his eyes tracing those curves. He'd never met a Gorgon before. A flash went off from behind Atlas, and he once again shooed the dryad. "Well, come in, come in." The hotel manager stood, waving a hand towards the 4 chairs that appeared in a puff of smoke. When none of them moved, she put her hands on her hips, watching them all eye the statues around her room. "It's all part of the show, my dears. They're just decoration." She sighed. "Well, most of them." Lucas tore his eyes away from the nearest stone head and nudged the Arcanist. "Well, go on, mate." His voice was barely a whisper. "Look her deep in the eyes." "Shut up, Poppy!" Atlas placed his hands on the back of the nearest chair, leaning in. "Why, hello. My name's Atlas. What's yours?" Her lips flattened, but recovered quickly. "My name is Miranda, manager of this fine hotel." She looked around at all the others. "What may I do for the 4 of you?" "Aren't you just a vision of lovely, Miss Miranda? We don't want to take up any of your time, at least not for business, but we're here from the courthouse and— Ah!" Miranda breathed in through her nose, letting out a small sound of exhilaration. "A new band of volunteers. Fantastic." She extended her hand and tapped her painted red fingernails on one of the stone heads. "The last group they sent wasn't up to the task. I assume you have the paperwork?" "Actually, that's what we wanted to talk to you about." Atlas quickly retrieved the roll of paper and handed it over. "There's been a clerical error. You see, we're only supposed to be here for 8 hours, but the paperwork says 8 years, and we were hoping you could fix—" "Oh, no. No. Your silver tongue won't work here." Miranda turned her smiling face toward the others. "Each of you will fulfill the requirements of your contract. You know, that lovely, legally binding document you have all signed. But do not worry. I do not want you to think of me as just your boss. We are all family around here." Miranda chuckled. "In that, family members don't get paid, and neither do you." The grin fell from her painted lips. "You are mine for the next 8 years, but it won't feel like a blink of an eye if you follow these simple rules." She pulled out 4 pocket-sized cards. "At the end of every shift, you will come to me and I will punch your time slip. But if you are late or do not show, I will not punch it. If you fail to complete your daily tasks or a guest complains about you, I will not punch it. If you try to run or talk your way out of work," Miranda moved her gaze to the Arcanist, "I will not punch it.
And if I do not punch your time slip, you do not get credit." A smile crawled across her lips. "And every day you don't get credit is another day added to your 8 years." She moved out from behind her desk and walked up to the group. She stared the battered machine up and down, rapping her knuckles against the middle of its chest. A hollow, tinny sound reverberated around the room, and she sighed. "Does it talk?" "Oh, right." Lucas slung his bag to the floor and began digging for the voice modules. Miranda ignored him and instead offered the robot a time card. "It's the boiler rooms for you." She then turned to the other dryad, looking her up and down with a smile. Stoic, silent, fearless. I like that." She held out another pocket-sized paper. "All the qualities required of a good, strong bellhop." She clapped the woman on the shoulder. "And you'll love your co-workers. They don't have much to say either." She turned to the 2 young men at last, finding the one still hunched over and digging through his bag. Miranda moved a hand to her hip, drumming her fingers against her side for a minute before the Arcanist, sensing her irritation, nudged the dryad with a foot. Lucas bolted upright, nearly clocking her in the jaw with his horns as he did. "Oh, sorry. I was just, He held up the handful of the gray bricks he had stashed. "For our metallic friend there." He shoved them into Unit 2's tiny hands with a nervous chuckle. Miranda sucked in a soul-steadying breath through her nose, letting the exhale ruffle her veil. "Fine." She held out the remaining 2 cards. "One of you needs to report to the Dire Liar to tend bar, and the other to housekeeping." She flicked her wrist several times before returning to her seat. "Now, out." The 4 of them found themselves in the hall outside of her office without actually moving, and the door slammed shut in their faces. Undine scowled and turned over her card. In faded green ink was directions for her to report to reception and pick up her uniform. "I simply do not have time for this." She made to rip the card in half, but found the thick cardstock was stronger than most metals. She let out a growl of frustration after struggling with the indestructible paper. Unit 2 moved along the hall, following the directions on the back of his card, as he sorted through the gray voice modules one at a time, holding them up close to inspect them with his damaged eyes. Atlas groaned. He looked down at his card. On the back was directions to housekeeping, and he shook his head. "Nope." He reached over and swapped cards with the dryad. "This bum leg of mine isn't going to allow me to do any manual labor." The back of this card had directions to the Dire Liar Tavern, and he smiled. "Besides, I need a drink." A noise of indignation and hurt fell from Lucas's mouth. He wanted to protest, but the Arcanist and the warrior dryad had already vaulted the hole in the floor and were walking down the hall, deep in conversation. He let out a long sigh and looked down at the wooden box he had pulled from his bag. "Come on, Dad. Guess we've got some rooms to clean." Laying in a soft plush bed and surrounded by the warmth of a roaring fire and a stone hearth, Piper knew she should feel relaxed. That she should let the thick, heavy blankets soothe her pain and help her drift off into a deep sleep. But instead, she kept turning over the small rectangle of gold in her fingers, watching the firelight dance across its surface. She had pulled that little reminder of her best friend from his coat pocket and was clutching it like a wishing coin. One side of it was blank, allowing her to catch glimpses of her tired, puffy red eyes. She had spent most of the morning crying until her tears dried up. The other side was stamped with what looked like a seed with a sprouting flower emerging from it. Vel never explained what it was, only that it was a reminder of his past, and that was all Piper ever managed to get out of him.
Atticus sat beside her on the bed, hair still damp from his bath, prattling on about the thick book Prince Varen had let him borrow from the castle library. But his words could hardly find her ears. There was too much angry buzzing coming from her own thoughts to hear him properly. But Piper did notice when Winter barged into their room without so much as a knock. She sat up, worried that something else had happened. And based off the look on his face, it had. "What is it? What's wrong?" Wailing, Winter held up 2 sets of fancy shirts and matching pants, one in each hand. "Look at this!" She frowned at them, scrutinizing each one before Piper turned a confused look on the lichen. She couldn't see anything wrong with them, other than one of them was red and it pained her to look at it. "Oh, what exactly is the problem?" "They're made of leather!" Winter slumped, his shoulders drooping until the clothes dragged across the floor as he shuffled into the room. "Those poor animals! I just want some ethically sourced, plant-based clothes." He looked up. "Is that too much to ask?" "Go naked, then. As hairy as you are, I doubt anyone would notice." Piper rolled her eyes and slumped back into the bed, pulling the earring back into the firelight. She watched the orange glow dance across the surface and felt another barb of pain lodge into her heart. Winter frowned, knowing all too well the tone of someone angry at the world. He cleared his throat. Hey, Atticus, I got a problem. Think you could help me out?" Happy with something to do at last, he jumped over his sister and dropped the book on the nightstand with a lopsided smile. "Sure thing! There's a bathroom right inside there." He pointed over the man's shoulder. "It's basically just a hole to the outside of the castle, but there's a sponge on a stick. Piper had to explain that part to me, but it's really fun to drop things out of and watch them fall all the way down into the—" "Not," Winter held up his hand to get the boy to settle down, "that kind of problem. But that's good to know. I'll check that out here in a moment. I was just wondering if you could find the prince and see if the 2 of you can forage up some clothes for me that aren't made from animals." He hefted up the garments, offering them over. "Oh, sure," Atticus chuckled. "How do you feel about dragons? Because in the Dragon Quest Chronicles, Book 4, the Black Knight makes a suit of armor from Zagori's abandoned scales, and he's practically impervious to all swords. In fact, the White Knight, as long as the animal wasn't exploited to make it, then I'll be okay with it." Winter waved off the boy and watched him practically sprint down the hallway in his rush to complete his task. Once out of earshot, he turned back to Piper and shut the door behind him. "I need to talk to you." Piper propped herself up on one elbow, frowning. Those words were never encouraging. "I just went to see if short stuff could help me, and I found this instead." He pulled out a square of parchment from the pocket of his jeans and handed it over. She took the page, unfolding it, and read, "Sorry, we're not feeling up for an adventure right now. Barry and I are going to head back to Oxhand and wait for Vel. Good luck, and don't worry about us." Evan had signed his and the bear's name at the bottom, and the ink spots on the page told her he had been in a rush to do so. Piper's eyes shot up to Winter. "Are they having a laugh? Back to Oxhand my backside?" Winter nodded. "My thoughts exactly. I think they're going to do something stupid." Ever since Piper had let Vel walk away, her blood had boiled with the desire to do the same. "Then I'm going too." She lurched off the bed, but her feet barely hit the stone floor before the lichen stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Hold up now." Winter lowered his hands, his face softening as he spoke. "I know how you feel, but before you run off all rash-like, maybe take a moment to think." "Think? I've done nothing but think since we left our friend to die like that. We could have stopped him." There was a quiver in her voice. "Should have." "That's not the type of thinking I'm talking about." "I get it. You're a coward." Piper glared up at him. "But don't you have a wife and a gerbil you should be headed back to? Or are you too scared to do that either?" Winter frowned at her, holding up his hands. Actually, I just told you all that so you wouldn't kill me. It's easy to make up a lie when you got a sword on your neck. He stopped his rambling with a sigh. Listen, I haven't always been the cool, collected stud you see before you. I've had my share of rash decisions, and I regret each and every one of them. Piper wasn't really listening to this little pep talk. Blood was rushing against her ears, blocking out the sound of his voice. But she could see the hurt in his eyes. I'll look after you and follow you wherever you want to go. But if you head back that way, to the tower and Vel, chances are you might not find him. And what you do find might be more than you bargained for. The real question is, do you want to drag your brother along to that kind of trouble? She froze. The boiling of Piper's blood had started with the hurtful words she had said to Chester and continued when she let her friend walk away. So much regret had been burning through her, she nearly forgot about her brother. How much worse would this feeling be if something happened to him? And he would follow her. You could also lie to him and send him off with the prince and the queen while you go off and... Winter rolled his hand in the air, letting the implication hang heavy between them. I get that you want to try and rescue your friend, but do you trust them enough to look after Atticus the way you would? He paused, studying her face for a moment. The way he would? Rage burned at her eyes, her body shaking. After everything she and that old cyborg had been through, saving Avis, tearing down the iron walls, birthday parties, Piper was mad that her best friend wasn't here to help her on their next adventure. So what would Vel do? Piper frowned at the thought. She looked from the note, clenched between the fingers of her mechanical hand, then over to the book sitting forgotten on her shared nightstand. He would keep them as far from danger as possible. He would look after Atticus. He would want them happy. She let out a long, shaky breath, feeling the tremors of rage begin to calm. Before her brain could tell her otherwise, she tossed the page into the burning fire. Fine. Piper forced a small smile on her face. Wise old owl. I'll stay. Winter put a hand on her shoulder and squeezed. Don't worry. Things always have a way of turning around. You'll see. He reached for the door. Get some sleep. I'ma go find your brother before he skins a dragon or something. When the lichen had disappeared into the hallway, Piper turned to the short, polished mirror that sat on the mantel above the fireplace. She stared at her bloodshot eyes and the way her body trembled when she breathed. She couldn't continue as the innocent and hopeful child. She had to be strong. For herself, for Atticus, for Vel. She pulled that golden earring from her pocket once more. Looking back into the mirror, she removed the tiny jeweled stud from her left ear and slid the golden loop into its place. It dangled gently, catching the firelight. She felt stronger now. Stay safe, watch over Atticus, and try to be happy. Piper pulled the coat closed over her chest like armor, and knew she could only promise her friend 2 of those 3 things. 6 hours of changing sheets, swapping out towels, and stocking all manner of miniature amenities, and Lucas would have been happy to never see another hotel room again, until he walked into his own closet-sized accommodations and spotted the welcoming mattress and plush pillows. Ah, thank Chrysanthemum. Dropping his bag to the ground, he slumped back onto the bed and his head hit the pillow. A long exhale escaped him, His new boss, a puckwudgie named Nori of all things, had worked him to the bone. According to the clock, it had only been 6 hours, but time flowed differently in this place. It was more like 12. Lucas had only helped work 4 floors worth of rooms, but each floor was like a mini hotel itself, over 100 doors on each level. And the higher up he went, the larger the rooms became. On the 4th floor, each door had led to a suite the size of a small manor house, which couldn't be possible as the doors in the hallways were barely 10 feet apart. Magic, he figured, but given the current rate things increased in size, he was not looking forward to the higher floors. He stared at his hands. There were blisters blooming on the tips of his fingers and on the backs of his knuckles. He was accustomed to hard work, but the fabrics and cleaners had sapped the moisture from his skin and left it raw. He closed his eyes, hoping that sleep would come quickly. But as he lay there, his mind refused to shut up. 8 years kept playing over and over in his head. This wasn't a horrible place to live, definitely more interesting than anywhere else he had visited, but that was a long time to stay in one spot, a spot where the only plants were the potted arrangements in the hallways, especially when all he wanted to do right now was keep moving. He sat up, deciding if he couldn't be asleep, he might as well unpack his things. He gently pulled out the box that contained his father's ashes and set it on the nightstand. He then pulled out the few changes of clothes he had brought with him and moved to the closet. Inside, he found several spare uniforms, each one in the hotel colors and tailored to make him look like a cymbal monkey. On the side of the closet was a laundry chute, presumably to have them cleaned between shifts. Deciding he didn't have the energy, he dropped his belongings on a shelf, then removed his sweater and his shirt, kicked off his shoes and his pants, and slumped back down into the bed. There were no lamps in his room, but light continued to pour in from the atrium, despite having closed the blinds as tight as they would go. In the room next to his, a headboard began rhythmically banging into his wall. Then he heard the muffled voice of Atlas and that of the 6-armed receptionist. Apparently, their rooms were right next to one another. Joy. Lest he be scarred any further, Lucas reached up and popped off his cochlear implants, letting the blissful silence calm his mind. He turned to set them on the nightstand and noticed something next to the box that he was certain hadn't been there moments ago. It was a sleep mask, plain and unassuming, but there was a folded paper plaque in front of it, and Lucas plucked it up, turning it over in his hands. In need of a good night's rest? Brain too wired to let that happen? Try on our patented Naptune sleep mask, named after the god of short rests and daydreams. Drift away to fond memories and familiar places, allowing you to tune out the noise and nap in peace. A courtesy to all employees of the Grand Echo Hotel. A well-rested employee is a productive employee. Lucas chuckled. Naptune? What the hell, he thought. If this was approved by the god of short rests and daydreams, then it was probably safe for him to use. He slid it on over his head and laid back down. Comfortably resting on the pillow, he snapped the mask in place over his eyes and waited for sleep to take him. He wasn't sure when it happened. He couldn't remember drifting off at all, but he found himself standing in the middle of the promised memory. It was a typical Sunday morning at You Better Believe It, the plant nursery he and his dad had owned. Tears prickled at Lucas's eyes as he recognized the familiar ferns and potted succulents. But this wasn't like any dream he had ever had before. He could feel the humidity beating on his skin as the sun poured in through the glass roof. The smell of soil, fertilizer, and the spring bulb display filled his nose. He closed his eyes against the gentle hum of the large fans and the chatter of birds.
Hey, Lucas, the sales numbers for yesterday seem a bit high. Are you sure this is correct?
Lucas's eyes snapped open and he spun around. His heart hammered against his ribs as his father stood there, one hand holding a thin stack of folders and the other a piping hot cup of coffee. A tear rolled down his cheek as he stared at the man he had never hoped to see again. From his sparkling hazel eyes to that bushy mustache that twitched as he read the numbers on the pages before him. Hand shaking, Lucas reached out for his father. He was surprised when he felt it connect with the man's shoulder, but despite his touch, his father never reacted. He just kept staring at the clipboard in his hand. "Dad?" Hudson DeVore glanced up, looking a little to Lucas's left.
Really? Mother's Day already? Huh, I hadn't taken that into account.
He glanced to where his father was staring, but saw nothing. His dad continued on with this one-sided conversation, blissfully unaware that standing before him was a version of his son 7 years in the future. Lucas realized that even though he could touch, hear, and smell, this was just a memory, a movie playing out in his subconscious. He pulled his hand away and followed his father around as he went about his morning routine, watering the annuals, snipping off dead leaves from the ever-finicky houseplants, and humming as he opened the cash registers, all while conversing with empty space. They came to a stop near the large Monstera plant, and Hudson glanced around before turning to his left.
Lucas, why are the fertilizer pallets here and not over there?
Standing to the right of his father, Lucas looked down and caught himself in a genuine chuckle. Before they started dating, he would make the new guy move them from place to place, just so he could watch him work up a sweat. "Sorry I'm late, Mr. DeVore. That was my fault. I meant to get in early and fix those." Rushing toward them, pulling on his red apron, was Vel. He pulled to a stop before the two of them, wearing a genuine smile. "I got caught up with the doctors at my mom's appointment." Lucas's heart gave a sad little throb, and he started to back away. Seeing his dad was bittersweet, cathartic almost. But this was pain.
Don't worry about it, my boy. You're here now. That's what counts. Move him back when you get a sec.
I'll get right on it. Lucas had made several more retreating steps when Vel turned his gaze in his direction, those green eyes locking almost directly on his. He grinned that stupid grin of his. "Hey, you." The mask hit the far wall as Lucas flung it from his face, sitting upright as his heart cracked wide open, releasing all the little shards of glass he had kept hidden within. He curled inward, forcibly burying his face in his hands, and wailed in agony over the ghost he thought he had left behind. You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description. What about this one here? I like the color. Oh, a fine choice, guaranteed to keep you warm. Nah, see that? That's wool, which means it comes from a sheep. Okay, this one? An excellent option. Cotton backing with a felt lining. Comfort and protection all in one. Nah, see, felt is made from animal fur and or wool, so no. Ooh, you have to pick this one. Ah, yes, the court's finest, the height of fashion for the discerning, suede with feather accents. Really? Come on, man. Look, do you have anything that didn't come from killing or exploiting animals?
Absolutely, sir. As the royal tailor, I have access to the most exotic of materials. You will find our finest silks this way.
Silk comes from silkworms, so no.
No, sir. Spider silk. Ethically sourced from abandoned webs from Arachni giganticus. No animals or insects were hurt in the making of this material.
Yeah, let's take another look at that wool shirt back there.
Do you have the feather one in my size?